the Nuremberg trials were, obviously the trials immediately after World War II, where all the Nazi and Nazi collaborators went on trial in front of the people that won the war. They kind of decided what happened to them. So I guess one of the first topics we could talk about is actually there was some heavy-handedness in creating the Nuremberg trials, especially the procedure behind them. One example is the main prosecutor, who was Supreme Court Justice Jackson. He actually picked the judges who would try the case, which a prosecutor picking his judge is obviously, I think, not a great thing for a legal system. Additionally, there wasn't really a lot of legal basis to rely upon. So, never before was there ever considered really any type of law or international law against a quote-unquote war of aggression. They tried to do it in World War I, but they failed incredibly, and everybody went free. And one of the reasons is because they let Germany prosecute their own people. They're like, yeah, no, we'll treat them like they should be. We'll get justice. And they're like, no, never mind. Get the hell out of here. And so the only thing they were going off of was the Kellogg Pact. And what that was in the late 1920s, a bunch of countries came together and said, yeah, let's not have a war anymore. That's basically all I was relying upon. Of course, that didn't really mean anything to most of the countries, but that's what they were relying upon when they did the Nuremberg trials. And so I guess one of the things that we could really look into and discuss first would be whether you think that you should be that the Allies had the moral right to necessarily create this heavy-handedness in order to try the Nazis the way they did. Would you guys have any thoughts on that so far?
Well, can I have a point of clarification
Sure.
first? So you said a chief justice picked. So a prosecutor picked. So for clarification,
yes.
A prosecutor was a chief justice from the United States?
Yes.
Or is that a title that's used? Okay. So why was the chief prosecutor someone who was only involved in the war very briefly at the end, and not because it was mostly Europeans trying other Europeans, right?
No. There was a large section of Americans that were within that realm. America was a big part of this. How the Nuremberg trials it was actually really interesting the way this developed. With the Nuremberg trials, essentially, it was during the war. It was kind of later in the war. Everybody was kind of getting together and be like, what are we going to do with the Germans after we get past this? And Churchill at first was like, let's line them all up and kill them. No joke, 100%. Until Stalin at one point made the joke. He was like, they were at a dinner or something at one of the conferences, and he was like, yeah, the British are going to kill 50,000 Germans. And then Churchill got really offended.
I can't imagine why Churchill would have gotten offended at that.
The idea...
He seemed like he'd be okay with it, frankly.
And then some people are like, okay, so maybe we shouldn't shoot every single Nazi person. And so Churchill was still on the plan of what he wanted to do was to destroy all the industry in Germany and have it only be in an agrarian society from then on to stop them from ever making war again. And then some people backed that idea, but then it kind of fell through, lost the idea. And so then the American side was like, and everybody else was like, hey, let's try them. Let's put them on trial. But what almost happened was, since everybody had different prisoners of war at the time, a lot of them were like, well, we're just going to have all 4 separate trials. And then people were like, no. That's not a good idea. Because they didn't want anybody getting a Russian trial. That was a legitimate concern.
That's fair. I guess then the heart of my question would actually be why, what legal system was used?
A mix of a lot of law. So, I mean, English and American law is very similar. And then the French law is very civil, which is much different than our system. and the Russian law was more like this French version, but they are also the kind of not great justice system at the time. And so it ended up being like a combination of both, where you had a little bit of mix of each, not including the Russian system, but like it was like a French and the English mix. So like the main difference is like for our common law type adversarial, you have like lawyers arguing to the judge, and the lawyers ask the witnesses questions, and it has very like lawyer based justice, compared to in the French world, it's very based on the judge. So the judge will ask questions of the witness, and they'll kind of conduct most of the proceedings, and like the lawyers are just there to like basically add to what the judge is doing in kind of like a very broad sense. And so they actually mixed it a little bit, where they kind of like were a little bit more lenient on what the judges could do versus restricting a little bit what the lawyers could do. So it's just kind of a mix, really.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry, just one more.
By all means, get them out there.
Question.
I'm sure this is all bonus points.
So then, in that case, what was where did the judge come from? Who was that?
Well, Chief Judge
was he also supplied by America?
Yeah.
Or
the judge? Yes. America was kind of like, well, I mean, as you saw after World War II, America was kind of like leading the way. It's kind of,
and it was the only one that wasn't like a crater. Yeah.
It was, basically. But they were kind of like leading the way, and they had been a little bit within the creation of this. For some reason, Justice Jackson was just like, he was a Supreme Court justice in the United States, so he was very well known, and he was very well respected. And then they were actually going to pick somebody for a judge at first, that was kind of like was more pragmatic, but then they were like, no, we got to find somebody who's not going to like the Nazis. So they picked someone else instead. Yeah. So it was kind of like a mix between Justice Jackson kind of got his pick of the litter, but I think it might have been President Truman at this time also was like, yeah, but I get a say in this as well. And so they kind of combined efforts to pick the right judges to do the trial. I can't remember off the top of my head if there was, I know there's at least American ones. I don't know if there's others. I think it was mostly American judges.
I'm looking at the Wikipedia page right now. Let's see. Looks like we have a lot of Americans. French Maine, a French alternate, a Soviet Maine, and a Soviet alternate, British Maine, British alternate. So it's 3 Americans, and everyone else brought 2.
There you go.
Interesting.
Okay.
Oh, and just like as a little fun note, there was actually many Nuremberg trials. If you didn't know this, you had them like you had like one like right after World War II where they got a lot of the big guys in. But there was like throughout the years they had a bunch of other ones that were kind of based on several different things. So that's where kind of Justice Jackson came from. It's like America was really leading the way, even at this point, really pushing forward with it.
Okay, so to make our way back to the question at hand, so you were asking. So, are you asking?
Is it okay to like take procedures that are aimed against the people getting prosecuted in this situation of where it was literally the Nazis?
So is it okay to break the law when you're talking about the Nazis, basically?
Well, I consider more as like, are you allowed to go outside of procedure, like doing something that's clearly like, couldn't you? Like not planting evidence, but can you stack the court when you're going up against the Nazis? It's kind of like a way of thinking it.
Right.
Yeah. Does the end justify the means?
I would personally say no.
No?
Because when you're stacking the legal system, that hypothetically, theoretically, the purpose of a court is to determine. Give me a moment to collect my thoughts, sir. The purpose of a court is to try to create the results that most that best approximates justice, I would say. And I think when you set a precedent or start a precedent by having a court that is mostly, it seems like they were just setting it up for a show more than anything. It seems like they were making a display out of it more than an actual trial. From obviously someone who hasn't taken a class on this, that's how it seems. When you sort of advantage one side over the other, even if you get the ultimate sentence that you want, inevitably, what ends up happening is that the way that you get there also has an effect. Like, it's not just ends justify the means. There are further ends beyond the sentence for the Nazis, and you've essentially set a precedent for something that doesn't look like justice, for something that is not approximating justice. And I think that has negative effects down the line.
I would say, at the end of it all, for particularly this case, maybe not in a more generalizable sense, but particularly this case, I mean, you could probably pretty easily get the means or the ends, I guess, you were looking for, because they were Nazis, and everybody in America and Europe hated them at that point. Well, everybody who would have been invited to this kind of thing, right?
Well, you have to think, though, is that there was nothing, like, there was the crimes against humanity aspect, but that wasn't the only thing being tried. And there was a lot of Nazis who weren't necessarily tied to it, who they were still trying to kind of make a criminal of. And mainly, the issue they had was the fact that they weren't relying on anything previously done, really, besides that one treaty that didn't really
They were inventing the law as they assigned
essentially, and they needed to put, like, some force behind it. Because one of the main worries, politically, was the fact that they have one trial, they have very little law, and the fact that if they get acquitted now, that means they are acquitted of the crimes that they committed. So basically, it was like, we have to get them now, and we have to make sure that we at least get enough of them that it makes it seem like we're not a joke. And that people, and kind of like they're forward thinking in that we have to make sure that, or we're trying to make sure that nobody does in a quote unquote aggressive war again. They're trying to make peace forward. So it's kind of like I think personally, I can kind of understand going a little hard for, number one, I mean, they were kind of in the wrong, and you knew that. But, like, at the same time, they had to be sure that they were going to be able to try them with this lack of law behind them.
So I get that makes sense to me. I guess in that case, then I still don't agree with the idea of, like, the prosecutor picking the judge.
Yeah.
That seems a little bit ridiculous. I feel like, you could very easily get around any arguments of, like, this is unfair by just having someone else pick the judge with the same mindset,
Yeah.
But I would say that in that case, since there was no precedent to go off of, inventing the law as you go, like, I mean, that's what the Supreme Court does all the time. Pretty much is interpreting the law in places where it's not clear. And they were trying to ensure that it didn't ever happen again. So it does make sense that they were effectively just, like, making stuff up as they go, particularly for the Nazis, because I mean, I would assume, since these were probably the best legal minds at the time, like, I would assume they did this in a way that was generalizable and could be applied to people in the future. And this is, like, where we get a lot of the crimes against humanity today, right?
Yeah, this in the Geneva Convention as well.
So, like, I think it's fine for them to personalize, like, to the point that this eventually became, yeah, I think it's totally fine to personalize the law for that reason.
You see, my concern is, like, you're talking about the precedent that we set with, like, future crimes against humanity, but, like, let's imagine a scenario where here in our narrow. We still are going off this Nuremberg trial precedent because that was really I think the last really high-profile case we've had of this nature, as far as I'm aware. So if we have this precedent set, let's imagine that some other crime against humanity needs to get persecuted in the future. I mean, imagine that, someone prosecuting crimes against humanity nowadays. But, let's say, someone from the U.S. or Europe is getting prosecuted in this way. Let's say that they had lost a skirmish against some ideological enemy. Let's, just throwing names out there. Let's say Russia and China and North Korea or whatever formed some sort of coalition, and there was some sort of conflict. And now, we're bringing people up for crimes against humanity as a outcome of this conflict. Well, now, thanks to the Nuremberg trials, you've pretty much set a precedent that would be accommodating for this to just turn into a complete kangaroo court and just kill whoever we want, because we've got the mandate of precedent behind us. No one can say otherwise. Like, that's, I think, a concern. Like, I sort of went off on a tangent on sort of like a ridiculous scenario because I can't imagine anyone just getting picked up for a crime against humanity in their own country at this stage in global geopolitics.
Got a DUI and a crime against humanity last week.
So maybe the scenario might muddy this, but I'm just saying, hypothetically, if we do have a crime against humanity trial in the future, we now have a precedent for being able to establish a kangaroo court against a geopolitical enemy instead of having an actual trial.
That's fair, but I would also argue that you could pretty easily, any prosecutor could argue, or defender, I guess, could argue, well, this is a very long time ago, precedent changes all the time. So that's an argument that could happen. But if it was the similar situation where like everyone's setting stuff up however they want and they're doing it because of precedent, I would say that might not happen unless there was comparable factors to the Nazis. So I think when you so I think we're talking about two different things. What I'm talking about is, James brought up that this was establishing the precedent for what a crime against humanity even is, and so thus they were inventing it as they go along. But we're also talking about the idea that, like, they were able to create what was effectively unfair legal systems because they wanted to make sure that the Nazis got away with it. So
did
I
not
would
get
argue,
away with it.
Yeah.
Or did not get away with it. Yeah, there we go.
Okay.
So I would argue that, like, if it was just from the side of the precedent of, like, this is what a crime against humanity is, I really don't see that as an issue.
Yeah,
I don't think it would cause an issue.
I have to agree with Ethan, just because we have so many like situations now where we have that set up at this point. We have the Hague Convention, we have the Geneva Convention, we have the the Nuremberg trials as precedent.
Has been modified. Yeah.
I mean, even now the U.S. is getting. Well, I mean, we're not a signer of the Hague Convention, but they're getting tried right now for the war crimes in the war in Afghanistan. So I feel like you don't need to create, since we don't need to create any law anymore because it's already on the books. I feel like it's not worrisome that we had to do it that one time to make sure that it got established.
Right, and it has since been established that, like, all right, but you can't just like rewrite it every time.
And this wasn't even like just crimes against humanity. I feel like that one was probably the easier, like the not easier, but like the less hard one to stick them with. I think the real hard one was in a war of aggression was like something that had never even been thought of before, as being that, and that established the grounds as well of the Nuremberg trials. And of course now we still have the Geneva Convention and all that to establish a war of aggression. But okay, well, if everybody's got there, we can try to move on to a different topic.
Certainly.
Okay, so this one's a little bit more like moral-based rather than legal. And this is the one I brought up to you, Sam, beforehand as an example of what we would talk about. And that there was a couple of people who've posted this question throughout the years after the Nuremberg trial. And one of the books that got kind of famous recently is the Kindly Ones, is what it's called. It's about a reformed SS officer. Not reformed, but it was after he served jail time after the Nuremberg trials. And basically, one of the claims that we learned about in class that he did was, you can blame the SS officer who was in charge of everything, but then you go down the line and you say, well, the person who was just manning his post at Auschwitz, well, he's still guilty as well. I mean, he was part of it. And you're like, well, was the dishwasher at Auschwitz also as guilty as the postman? Was the person that, was changing was the train conductor who might not even known where the Jews were going, was he guilty as well for being the one who conducted the train? So I get the question is, how far down the line of like menial tasks or of like less and less connected tasks does this guilt go from being part of this mechanism of killing so many people?
So my initial reaction to that is, I hate when people bring up so I hate the argument that well, you can't say this person did this because, obviously they were more or less culpable or than this other person, and comparing it to someone who did something worse or better. There are degrees of things. So obviously the train driver was not as guilty as the SS officer who was literally shoving people into the camps and showers and whatever, right?
Yeah.
But I would also argue that, I think everybody with any kind of morals felt a certain amount of guilt, certainly after the war was over. And I think I can understand, mob mentality is a thing. There's a reason that dictators are always able to take over countries, is because there's a part of human nature that at a certain point we just sort of discard a lot of our morals that we would normally ascribe to. But at the same time, I really don't think you can say that anyone who was involved is innocent. There are certainly people who are less guilty. There are certainly people who are well, I need to feed my family, and I'm not gonna flee to some other country because the Nazis might win, and then I'm screwed. So I'm just gonna drive the train instead of actually hurting people, or cook the food instead of actually hurting people. But
rational decision making, yeah.
Yeah, but you can't sit there and say that they were not guilty either, I don't think, to a certain extent. Obviously, it's not the same amount again.
So do you think the guy who just he was just there washing dishes for the staff of Auschwitz, say for their dining hall, do you think he still has a level of guilt for such an
personally? I would imagine. Yeah, I would imagine everybody who.
Well, I don't mean guilt as in do they feel bad about it. I'm saying, do you think that he was guilty of being involved?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep, I can agree with that on a conditional level. So wheeling this back to fundamental principles. It's if we're going to determine, okay, was the dishwasher guilty? Well, we need to determine, why was the guy who put people in the gas chamber, why was that guy guilty? What did he do? What didn't he do? And so, as I'm not totally educated on this topic, the people who were operating the gas chambers, those were military personnel, technically, right?
Well, not necessarily.
They were part of the SS. No?
Well, it depends on what part of it. So I'll kind of I was going to bring this up a little bit past, but a little bit past this conversation. But so one of the arguments that comes up here is intent versus action. And the reason why is because there's this record of this man who was like a kind of like a pesticide person. He was very intelligent in this field of pesticides, and he didn't know what he was coming to do, but essentially he delivered the pesticides to Auschwitz, that was basically the main gas they used. I can't remember the name of it, but he basically came in and kind of like installed it in a way. So he was directly involved in the gas chambers, but he didn't really have like the knowledge of this was killing massive amounts of people.
Okay, that's not necessarily what I was asking, but thank you. That is decent context.
Okay.
I was more asking, it's like the people who absolutely got themselves convicted at the Nuremberg trials, and the people who
they pulled the
we would say
lever,
fundamentally deserved it. The ones that pulled the trigger. Generally, the people who were doing the actual act of killing, pulling the lever on the, the trolley problem lever, those people,
more or less SS.
They were SS. They were military personnel, correct?
Yes, as I'm aware.
So, in order to not do what they did, that would be not only, like they can't just walk away from their post. Like they could, hypothetically, they could just say, no, I'm not going to do this and walk away. But there would be consequences for that beyond them just, not being able to come into work the next morning. That would be insubordination. That would be a crime for them to say, no, I don't want to kill all these Jews, even though, it's in my
adding
job.
a little point in there
Right.
as well. I'm not entirely sure, and that's because I know the in Ukraine area, once they started taking it over, they used to have roaming packs of commandos, they were called, and they would go around killing Jews in every town. And if there's reports and kind of first person, kind of not first person, but the term I can't think of it when it's there's primary sources that say that if a person didn't want to do it, they could be transferred to a desk job. So I don't know if that applies to the military officers in Auschwitz, since they weren't necessarily going around killing people. They were doing something that probably wouldn't be regarded as such as much.
Right, but you've also got to consider
there'd be a loss of honor and probably family security.
Loss of honor, all that stuff, as well as the fact that what are your options if you're in the military, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I don't want to sound like I'm coming across defending the SS and stuff like that, but
I mean, you are being recorded saying that,
realistically,
so I could twist as much as I want.
Just cut out the part where I say I don't want.
Yeah, no.
Just say I defend the SS. But what are your options? I can either work here, where my family's 20 miles away. I got a house, and I get to eat, or I get to fight on the Eastern Front.
Yeah, I mean that could have been yeah. I mean, Auschwitz is probably pretty, obviously horrible, but that might have been a nice post.
Yeah. So to that, I don't think there is any way you can say they are not guilty in some way.
Nah.
At the same time, I can say, look, I get it. Because
that's the point I'm getting. That's the part I cut out.
Not in the sense of I get why they did it,
mm-hmm.
or I get, I understand it, because my dad's from Israel, but I do understand at an objective level that there is parts of human nature that can be very easily influenced and manipulated far beyond what anyone would think they're capable of.
Mm-hmm.
In times of high stress and in times of rapid change, where people's opinions and what they're capable of changes. Well, I guess I'm literally just repeating myself from 30 seconds ago, but anyway, what I'm saying is I do objectively understand how that can happen to human beings,
Mm.
to people who would normally not be able to do that, especially if, like, obviously the people who are pulling the levers and stuff, screw them, man. Like, they're clearly guilty. That's definitely not a job you needed. You needed for any reason. But, the cooks or the train drivers, I can see very easily how someone could rationalize to themselves, like, well, I don't know exactly what's happening in there, and I don't ever see it, so maybe it's just sensationalism or something like that, because their number one priority is protecting their family. So, yeah.
I mean, James, you know this about me. Philosophically, I'm a materialist. So that's kind of, it's fundamentally incompatible with, I think, most legal systems. As far as I'm concerned, we're all meat computers, and no one's really technically responsible for anything. But getting back onto the proper topic at hand here, I was just trying to look at the fundamental principles that we were working with. So I was thinking, if it was insubordination not to work at Auschwitz, essentially, not to be the one pulling the lever, essentially what that would mean is that the Nuremberg trials place on individuals a sort of fundamental responsibility, that you are according to both ethics and now international, we're saying that you have an obligation to rebel against the laws of your own country when your own country is commanding you to participate in a system that is engaged in crimes against humanity.
Well, that's pretty damn messy.
Yeah, that is messy.
Yeah, that would.
I mean, I feel like
that
as hearing people's opinions on this of who is guilty. It seems like that is actually a lot of people's general belief is that if you were in any way complacent, if you were one of the bystanders in Germany during the time that this was happening, then somehow you were complacent as well, which I personally don't agree with. But it just seems like a general agreement in with a lot of people.
That's a general agreement I can see, and is that what we can derive from the Nuremberg trials outcome? Is that a principle that it seems like the Nuremberg trials were the outcomes advocated for? Essentially, is that these people who we have convicted of as guilty, they had an obligation to be in rebellion against their government in order to and not be a participant in the crimes against humanity.
I mean, it wasn't part of the reasons why they wanted to make it. Whether that was the outcome due to the decisions, I mean that just depends on how people interpret it. And it seems like a lot of people determine that the bystanders are indeed complacent, which I think. I mean, I don't think anybody could necessarily say if saying that you don't rebel against a government that is heavily militarized and heavily leaning towards capital punishment as Nazi Germany was. I don't think it's fair to say that if you didn't act against them, therefore you are not morally upright.
Especially with what we know about psychology and all that stuff now. I mean, the bystander effect is an established phenomenon.
Absolutely.
And I couldn't even imagine what it was probably like living in Nazi Germany when, maybe you weren't even near one of the concentration camps. And I've read a lot of conflicting reports on this. Some people saying, oh, everyone in town knew what was happening in the concentration camps, and other people saying, oh, yeah, I mean, we didn't know until after we were shown the videos, after the Allies took over.
There was a very interesting video that we saw, actually, from a class. It was about this town in Germany where there was these... where this town is basically at one point it was half Jew, half Christian, and then Kristallnacht happened, and literally they ran the Jews out of the town, and a lot of Christian families moved into the Jewish family's houses, and it stayed like that, and until now even there's no Jewish population, and a lot of the Christian families recognize they live in once Jewish houses, and a lot of the kids grew up knowing that. but the people that were old enough and 100% absolutely took part of it, or at least knew about it, deny it wholeheartedly, say no, that never happened.
Huh.
I wasn't part
So
of
the
that.
people who are like, I've been living here my whole life, and they're like, Grandpa, you're 96. Were you part of the thing where the entire town threw out the Jews and stole their houses? Don't remember.
No,
No.
that never happened. We were the other
Interesting.
people did that.
It's the Alzheimer's. I can't remember any of that.
Yeah, and it was people would do that with a
the whole
smirk
reason
on their face. It was crazy.
The whole reason I ask is like, I'm just trying to figure out, in order to get like a decent answer to this question that's not, just completely based on, like, I kind of feel this, is like, so someone who's, sentenced to death or convicted as a result of the Nuremberg trials, where would they have had to have stopped in order to not be guilty? What step did they need to not take? I think maybe that's a better way of framing
that's an interesting
that.
question. Depending on which trial, it really kind of just involved who they wanted to throw on the stand a little bit. An example would have been like, there was, in the first one, I'm pretty sure Goring was in the first trial, was one example. Super Nazi, 100% didn't like Jews, 100% deserved to be on trial. And then you would compare that to, I can't remember his name, but he was basically the leader of the Nazi Navy, and he was like not involved at all with the Holocaust. He was just a military commander. I think at one point he shot at people that were trying to like survive from a boat getting sunk. Like a British boat got sunk, and there's people like trying to survive, and I think he shot at them at one point from the sub. But that, again, that's like that one time. And then he got thrown onto the stand as part of like the war of aggression type of issues. So it was like, how guilty was he? That's hard to say. How guilty was Goring? A lot. So there's like that wide variety. And it's very hard to tell where this point stands.
Right, and I think what it comes down to is, it's not obviously, with all of the different extenuating circumstances that go into it, it's not possible to say how guilty someone is. Not really.
Yeah.
But it is possible, I think, to say that someone's guilty enough. So I think you can pretty easily make the argument like, okay, if they sentenced people to die, they're probably guilty enough for the death penalty, right? Because they were actively part of the Holocaust that killed people, right? And in the war of aggression charges, I don't know exactly what the details are on that, like legally speaking, but I would imagine the person who heads up the German Navy had a couple of says in the whole war of aggression thing, especially since the Nazis sunk a bunch of civilian ships.
Yeah, he was found guilty, by the way. The guy who was Karl Donitz is Donitz. I don't know. There's an umlaut in there.
I love them.
But the Navy commander, he was sentenced to 10 years. Actually, that was his.
Interesting.
Were
there any death sentences for the war of aggression charge alone?
That's a good question. Well, the reason it's hard to separate that is because a lot of the people that were in charge of that would also have been in charge of the first, or would have been of the final solution, not the first solution.
Right. the first version.
Yeah, no, a lot of people.
First Reich.
Donitz, however you spell his name, Sperance's name, he was kind of like a isolated incident where it was like, oh, he was just the Navy commander. Whereas most of the people who were involved in the upper military were also involved in the Holocaust as well.
Hitler's inner circle.
Exactly.
And stuff, yeah.
Donitz was kind of like he was an isolated instance because look at Goring, head of the Luftwaffe, also incredibly involved in the SS. So it was kind of
Himmler in Egypt most of the time.
Yeah. So it's kind of hard to differentiate. Do you guys think that it was intent or action that should bear whether somebody was guilty?
I think when you're talking about something as serious as charging them with, relation to the Holocaust and potentially giving them the death sentence. I think both have to play a role.
Okay. So if there was no intent, but the action, say like the guy who installed the pesticide, who basically was one of the guys who he delivered the thing that they killed millions of people with, but he didn't have any intent necessarily. Do you think that he think he still has a level of guilt that could get him charged, or he should be charged?
I think you would have to prove that he did deliver the pesticide with some amount of okay, I don't really care about what's going on here, or I don't really know what they're doing, but if it does kill Jews, who cares, right? Yeah, I think you would have to prove that to a certain extent, because I don't think you can charge someone with participating in that if for the same reason, if you go drop off a hammer at someone's house someday. This was an argument that Socrates made. If you go give someone a hammer or a bat or some weapon, and then they use it to kill someone, are you guilty in any way? And if you don't know that they're going to use the hammer to kill someone, then you're not guilty, because how could you be? But on the flip side of the coin, if at some point this pesticide man found out what they were doing with it and continued to deliver it, continued to provide his expertise so that they could continue with the systematic murder of 6 million Jews and however many other people, then I think there is a level of guilt for him. Certainly more than any cook or train driver, I think.
I think what I'm taking from that is what it basically came down to is, you said intent does matter to a certain extent, but at the beginning there, you pulled it back with you were talking about essentially that if the thought had come into his mind that he might be accommodating a genocide, but he didn't follow up on that thought, that would be a certain level of intent that you think would make him to an extent guilty. And
I think that in a legal process, I think that it would probably get messy around that point.
Yes.
Because at the beginning of my conversation, I was coming from the perspective of, okay, this guy allegedly never knew, right? So it would be incumbent upon the prosecutors to say, well, clearly he knew for X, Y, and Z reasons. Like he told his wife, I don't care what they do with it, blah, 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 blah. That's where I was coming from.
Yeah.
And then by the end of it, I was saying, something a lot more black and white.
I see. Yeah, because with the previous thing, I was just thinking it's if he legitimately didn't care what they did with it, and that still made him guilty, that means you're just basically charging someone with apathy, which I think, and not to get a bit too topical, I think in the United States we have quite a few people who would have been guilty by that standard, even today.
Yeah, certainly, but my point is, particularly with people who provide weapons or provide a service that directly impacts this kind of crime, this kind of disgusting behavior. Someone who is effectively like an accomplice, right? If they're an unknowing accomplice, how can you charge them? And if they are knowing to a certain extent, that's where it gets gray and messy, and that's why the legal process exists, to discuss and debate that part. But where it comes black and white is, if they didn't know, I don't think there's any guilt associated with it.
Interesting. Sam, do you feel the same way?
Same for the train drivers and other people who provided services.
I think I'm a little bit leaning the other way. I think almost on like similar to what you think, but on an opposite scale. Where I think really, I don't think what happens from the act is necessarily as important as so much as the intent is. I think the intent is everything, and that the act is what just kind of like, it kind of ups or downs the guilt, but I think the intent is very important. If he didn't intend to do it at all, I don't think there's a level of guilt that should be had there. I mean, obviously on a conscious level.
That's what...
Oh, is that? Sorry, I misinterpreted what you said.
Yeah, that's pretty much what I'm saying. Is like, if the intent was, I should have got to define your terms. I should have more clearly articulated. But basically, if the intent is, I'm dropping off some pesticide for this military base to use, because I got to drop off some pesticide. Cool.
But
how can you call this guy guilty?
But do you think that there is some almost like intent to be negligent on intent? Like if he was like, I'm not going to look into that at all. Like, okay, this military base wants pesticide. Not Jewish people started going missing. Not going to look into it at all. Not even going to think about it. Just going to drop it off and mind my own business. Do you think that itself doesn't bring along with it like the ability to be charged with crime against humanity through association and through neglect of looking further?
Once again, I think that's charging someone with apathy.
That's fair. I thought of that as soon as it just came out of my mouth. I went, Sam just made a point on this that I agree with.
I would say, first, I think what we're discussing is like simultaneously theory and reality. And so I was discussing like in theory, this person, this hypothetical person who's selling the pesticide, who has no idea what's happening and could not have any way of knowing when he sold the pesticide, that person is not guilty. It does get messier, but I still think it's incumbent upon the prosecutor to bring forth evidence that shows like clearly they had the opportunity to find out, to look into it, to learn what they were doing and how bad it was, and they still chose not to, because at a certain level they already knew.
Yeah.
I think that's the important part to stress, is the prosecutor would have to prove that this person at some level already knew what was happening and then willingly didn't look into it more. Obviously, the person who like supplies the pesticide happily and is like, yeah, sure, use it to kill the Jews, they're guilty.
Yes.
But the place that the prosecutor would have to put in the work is where they have to say, all right, well, this statement and this note and this whatever show us that you were pretty sure what was going down in there, but you purposefully did not look into it further so that you could continue doing your thing. And that's where the legal system goes all great, because I mean, how much of that is that person's fault? And I think a significant amount of it is.
I think with where this discussion has led, we all seem to have come to a consensus on James's actual question. We just seem to be muddying it. Yeah, at the end of the day, I think we're all in agreement that intent is what really matters. Yes. Because, like, if we flip the script here, what about the person who shoots at a Jew and misses?
Yep,
they're still guilty.
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, definitely.
Yes, he is.
So I think at the end of the day, it's not the outcome that we're so much worried about. It is the intent. So to answer your question, James, intent is what matters, I think, as far as this chat is.
Well, I would argue no. I still stand by the fact that I think they're equally important. Because
so you think that the person that misses is less guilty than someone who hit?
No,
because that's about the outcome.
No, what I'm saying is, the person who believes in everything the Nazi Party is saying but doesn't contribute and actively works against them taking over Germany, or for another example, the Northerners who were still very racist but fought against the South, I think they're less guilty than their opponents.
Okay.
I understand that. Okay,
Which
I see where your point's coming
kind-
from. Now.
Action is very important because you can still be disgusting and have all of the same gross viewpoints, but you can have a certain level of, well, I'm a human being. I can make a decision not to act on these for X, Y, and Z reasons, and thus, how can you blame them in the same way as someone who was presented with the exact same decision and made the wrong
this
choices?
actually leads a little bit into the next area I was going to go. There was another person on trial that was kind of an isolated, not really connected to the super high SS cabinet members, similar to the Navy commander, Karl Donitz. This man was, I'm going to butcher this name, it's Hjalmar, I think?
Oh,
Hjalmar
what do you mean?
Schott?
That was beautiful.
Hjalmar Schott. There we go. He was
Nailed it.
he was part of what's called the conspiracy charge. And essentially what that is it was a cheap way for the Allies to kind of get everybody they needed. And so they weren't necessarily...
Like racketeering.
A little bit, yeah. It's that's what essentially was. Because they were confused, or not confused, they were questioning how they were going to set up the charges to get everybody in order to make it so they were forceful as well. Because, you can't charge anybody with a crime against humanity. You couldn't charge the head of units, the small units in the military with this. And so what they did was they created what they called the conspiracy to, I think it was the conspiracy to commit war, basically. It was their charge of conspiracy to commit an aggressive war. And so what they did was they basically said anybody could be charged with this. That was basically any sort of leader in the military, even down to the leader of like a 5-person unit in the military, all the way up the chain. And they could even charge like broad organizations. Like they could say the entire SS organization is charged with this conspiracy. And so this man, Hjalmar Schott, was actually he was a lead economist and banker within the Weimar Republic era and into the early Nazi period. And he basically helped Hitler gain power through financial means. And he helped Hitler and he helped Nazi Germany like create a lot of the wealth and the economics that they based their war preparation on. And it wasn't until about, I think, 1939 that this man, who basically funded Nazi Germany and the Nazis' rise and all that, and funded their economic power within the war, he didn't stop helping them until about 1939, basically. And
what happened to him after that?
He did some kind of some minimal resistance activity, but not a lot. And around 1945, he was captured by I think it was it was 1944. He was arrested after the attempt on Hitler's life, like when they were trying to assassinate somebody was trying to assassinate Hitler. They thought Schott might be included, and so they arrested him, put him in a concentration camp, and then he was liberated by the Allies in like 45. But he was put on trial, part of this conspiracy to help Hitler do a war of aggression. So here's a man who, for about 6 years, had the intent of helping Hitler, acted to help Hitler, but then went and did kind of some resistance activities afterwards when he found out what Hitler was. And do you think that he could be put and found guilty through the Nuremberg trials?
Yeah, for sure.
But why?
Well, I would say
conspiracy
is
he
almost
was acquitted,
like not
100%
big enough.
acquitted. But go on.
Really?
Yep, 100% acquitted.
Conspiracy seems almost not big enough because I'm surprised they didn't put more emphasis on the fact that this guy helped overthrow a sitting government that was established by a previous...
Technically, he didn't overthrow. Technically,
right?
People are allowed to rebel. Like, I don't think they couldn't. I mean, they weren't going to charge people for that.
Right, but like, clearly his impacts contributed significantly. And I don't necessarily know that having a change of heart after what you've done for the past several years has like led to this gigantic problem, the worst war in history, blah blah blah. You know, you could make a case for saying like, if this guy financed the Nazi party in their rise to power and found a way to make sure it, didn't go out of money and get swept away like most other resistance movements or whatever when they run out of the ability for everyone to eat. Um, like you could make a case and say that this guy was one of the 5 most important people in turning the Nazis into the Nazis.
But I think
and making sure
this is one of the, at least in my mind, this is one of the situations where you have to think from the perspective of a German at that time. There's no one's killing Jews in the street yet. Kristallnacht hasn't happened yet. Jews are looked down upon.
That's what's being argued, though.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm just saying, like, his climb into power, basically, of that, like, he was helping a government that he was very German. He enjoyed the German government. He's very nationalist. And, as much as we see the Nazis now as being horrible, at the time, anti-Semitic, yes, but who wasn't at that point? As long as you weren't, like, killing Jews in the street, you could be compared to the U.S., who really didn't like Jews either. And so, to see this guy who was basically just saying, hey, let's make our country rich, let's make Germany the best that we can. And then even when it became like Hitler was like doing stuff to the Jews, he vocally came out and said that he didn't like what the unlawful activities against the Jewish minority at one point. So I feel like, as much as I would say that, yes, anybody who was like the head of the Nazi party during like the 1937s, or 1937 era, yes, I would think that they would be guilty of some sort. But I feel like this guy, purely economic, was the economic minister and was trying to help his country and trying to help them like raise arms in order to have a good military after the Treaty of Versailles basically destroyed them. I think that I don't see how he could be found guilty in the regards of a war of aggression area.
Well, what I would say here, and he wasn't convicted of war of aggression, was he? Or he wasn't. What was he? He was charged with
conspiracy for war of aggression.
Conspiracy thing.
Essentially, it's a crime.
Conspiracy to create a war of aggression.
Planning and waging a war of aggression is what it was.
This goes back to my point of like, I don't think that charge, like, I guess it doesn't work for him, yeah, but I think there is another charge that they could have come up with that did.
Yeah.
Because like, he wasn't part of any of the war, you're right, but he was certainly very impactful. And it's also a farce to say that, like, the Nazi party made sense and there was no other good one before they went crazy, because the Nazi party was small for a while.
Mm-hmm.
And there were tons of other options. And it wasn't until they like had some major victories and the writing was sort of on the wall that obviously they were going to get some power, that and after several elections, I think, that they
he wasn't backing them from like 1922, like when Hitler joined, but it was like from like the late 20s they started backing them. But
right, but I don't know how. I don't know how you can look at someone who says we are going to take over Germany, and we're going to get rid of and ethnically cleanse our country of all the inferior races, and say, all right, cool, I'll help you, I'll finance you and everything like that. That's fine. And then you actually do it. You go through the whole thing and you do it. And it's not until he declares war, not like when he's starting to institute all of the policies of like, okay, Jews have to wear the star, or, all of the other things that predated the Holocaust that led to the Holocaust being so easy to happen, or so easy to implement. He saw all of that.
Yep.
And it was fine, as far as I'm aware. And it wasn't until the war actually happened, which, you from a very cynical perspective, you could even argue that he didn't like the war because it wasn't economically sound. Why not just continue growing?
Something he did say. But go on.
Boom.
He said he didn't.
Oh,
He
wow.
didn't like how
So he didn't even
military
care about
focused
the
the spending was in Germany during the later years.
Yeah.
Cynicism
So
is so often rewarded.
yeah. So like, you know, it's not like he would have necessarily not supported the idea behind the Holocaust. In fact, he almost certainly did support the idea behind the Holocaust.
Wait, what? No, he was very against hurting Jews.
Well, I mean, in a broad sense, though,
Oh, I
like
see.
if
You're saying he like supported it not necessarily through words, but just like through with his actions he did. I see what you're saying.
well, and like, I mean, you can say, oh, I didn't like the Holocaust, but I mean, we should probably put them in their own towns because that's what they did first. Or we should probably make sure they wear a star because you can't trust them. You know, he was all fine with that. He was just like one step lower
Yeah.
than everyone else, right?
He was with the general anti-Semitic
I mean,
principles.
but like, again, I think that's the idea we have to think of, though, is the fact that, I mean, everybody was anti-Semitic. And I'm saying, like, obviously,
Right.
we look back now and we're like, that's terrible, but, like, at the time of the Nuremberg trials, putting us ourselves in those shoes, I don't think we can use that as a justification when almost the entire world is basically anti-Semitic.
Right, but not the entire world didn't actively contribute to a structure that, like, I mean, you know, America was pretty anti-Semitic. The UK was pretty anti-Semitic, but they didn't have laws on the books that
So,
stated.
quick question: could we charge Henry Ford with the same thing?
No, because he didn't actively contribute to a structure that systematically. Oh wait, no. Yes,
He did actually.
Yeah. For some reason I was like, yeah, but yeah, I think you could
Really?
Okay.
definitely because I mean,
Obviously,
it's
we
a
weren't
farce.
going to, but
Yeah, it's a farce
Retroact.
to say that, oh, all I did was completely supply them with all of the resources they needed to commit all of these crimes and disgusting
Do
atrocities.
you think Volkswagen should be
That's not-
tried?
The car, yes. I want to hear it defend itself in court.
Okay. Sam, what are your
we
thoughts?
now call
I
to the
don't.
stand Herbie the Love Bug.
Yeah.
Oh.
Pixar animators.
To be
just,
fair, we do need a try for that
permanent.
wood paneling on cars. Who thought that looked good?
It was horrible.
Ugh,
It still is horrible. I see it all the time.
it's terrible. Sam, I haven't heard your thoughts so far. I don't think not fully thought out.
I mean, my Henry Ford comment was about as strong as my opinions on this get.
Well, I mean, you didn't say that we
mean-
should. I didn't think I heard you. I'm sorry.
Right. Yes. So, it's difficult for me to say that financially supporting something that you see, this is the problem right here with these Nuremberg trial things, is that like we're trying to come up with a legal justification for it when really the law was uh made at the seat of their pants, and so trying to like figure out exactly where the lines are complete. It feels like an exercise in futility here.
Well, I mean, don't think about the law
I
then.
can
Think about just
speak
like
from an ethical
Yeah.
standpoint and just say, anti-Semitism is bad, and he should feel bad. But as far as legal culpability is concerned, I mean, I don't even know where that line would be in the bog standard American system, and we have that pretty well locked down. So,
Well, can I make one point then?
Sure.
And so I've been dominating the conversation, but I just want to.
for this, I think it's appropriate because I don't have much to say.
So other things.
Sam, you're gonna like the next topic, but you can continue.
Other things that. What was this guy's name again?
Hjalmar Schacht. I don't know how to pronounce that last
Right.
CH.
Other things that Schacht was okay with was when there was what was it called? The appeasement policy, where Hitler would go around and just take things from other countries. He was fine with that. He still bankrolled
Well,
them.
yeah, I mean,
right?
that
He
was just
still
like that's just a country doing its thing. Like, I mean, it's growing. I mean, America was still
Right.
taking terror. It was still like destroying the Native Americans at the time.
So what I'm saying, and I don't agree with that either. What I'm saying is, like, this guy, and it's not just like, anti-Semitism bad. This was at a level, even in like 37, 38, it was at a level that was far beyond most other countries in the
A
world.
lot of aggressive
It was
expansion.
already at a level where there was persecution significantly. And this guy was, I mean, to my knowledge at least, correct me if I'm wrong, this guy was totally fine with it. It wasn't until Germany financially damaged itself by going to war that he had a problem, and then maybe he had some like, come to Jesus moment later in the war. But I would argue that someone as pragmatic as this guy seems to be was probably just like, well, Germany's going to lose, so I'm going to say I didn't like it, right?
He didn't step down. He was kicked out. He got kicked out.
Probably because he wasn't extreme enough.
I
But
think that's what it was, because he spoke out several times against the Nazis, like Crystal Knot and stuff like that. Because remember, he wasn't around when they started the Holocaust for real. 1939,
right,
that hadn't like happened really yet. It was just like
right, but even
still rampant anti-Semitism that was far past what other people had at that time.
Yes, and so what I'm saying is like, you can't say this guy was like the uber Nazi, right? He wasn't a Goring. You're right, but his actions, in a lot of ways, contributed more directly and like, if we're going back to intent as well, he intended for his actions to contribute more significantly than maybe any other general, or not even any general, or any influential figure in the Nazi Party outside of a few people, towards them rising to power, instituting the prejudice laws that predated the Holocaust, that were clearly like the prelude to something more, because it kept getting worse and worse and worse. And this guy stood by, and he was fine with it, and he continued to support this system. He continued to support the system where Hitler was defying international law, continued to support the system where Hitler was, suppressing political opponents and destroying opposition through what would be considered, maybe even by their own laws at the time that he was doing it, highly illegal.
Well,
so
let me ask you this then.
He was fine with all of that.
Let me ask you this then. Do you think that a arms creator in Nazi Germany at the time, because this is another person that was put on trial, an arms creator, a person who ran a company that created arms, do you think that they were equally as guilty as this guy was for, not necessarily being a full-on Nazi, but supporting them in a way that allowed them to do what they did?
Well, that's the whole point of Schindler's List, right?
I mean, I guess, but my question is, do you think that, I guess, the equivalent of what Schindler was without the, resistance aspects was okay?
So, I would say that not as guilty as this guy.
Really? You think Schott was actually more guilty?
Yeah, and I think, the point I'm trying to make is, I think Schott, up until the very end, Schott was maybe one of, if not the most guilty person in the Nazi Party outside of the top 2 or 3 people.
Yeah, and I think, like, listening to what Ethan's saying, I think I am trying to parse it out here, and I can see where he's coming from there. It's like, say you're a weapons manufacturer.
Mm-hmm. He also escaped charges.
Nazi Germany, but then Nazi Germany decides to start being Nazi Germany, and you with your moral compass as the head of this weapons manufacturer, you say, no, we're not going to help that. We're not going to do that. What would happen then, almost inevitably, if I understand market forces correctly, is someone else would sell guns to the Nazis. Whereas the person that we're discussing here, Mr. very German name,
Hammerschacht.
Homer shocked. No one necessarily needed to provide this financial support to the Nazi Party, and yet because he did, that ended up being a significant and impactful thing on history. Like, whereas the arms manufacturer fairly helpless to actually stop what's going on, this man has a certain share of responsibility in starting it, which
and perpetuating it until the very end.
yes,
interesting.
There's a certain, I think hindsight is 20/20 aspect to that, but I think I can understand where Ethan is coming from. Before we move on to the next question, I have some hard-boiled eggs in the kitchen I would like to retrieve. Do we have time for that?
Yeah, absolutely. I have a funny anecdote I can tell Ethan anyways. It's funny. So the arms dealer I mentioned was named Krupp. Still an arms dealer today. Not him specifically, but his company.
The company, okay.
Yeah. No, they merged with somebody, but it still has Krupp in the name. They're in Amsterdam, I think.
Interesting.
Anyways, but it's funny. So Alfred Krupp was the owner, or the now owner. His father used to be, and his father was really old at the time. And they, through a mix-up of records, they actually indicted the father instead of the son. And so before they could try him, the father died, so the charges were dropped. But
so he was fine.
Well, hold on. Alfred got put on trial later, just not for the conspiracy, but for slave labor, because Jews.
Oh
yeah,
something extra. So this guy was one of those
he was Schindler. But
isn't Schindler a real guy though?
Was it? Maybe. But this guy was basically Schindler, but not the good parts.
Right. So he used the labor of a concentration camp to.
He eventually got tried again, for basically all 4 charges.
Interesting.
Yeah.
How late did the Nuremberg trials go? They went into the 80s, right?
I don't. Well, I mean, it depends if you count Eichmann. Eichmann would have gone into the 80s. Do you know who Eichmann is?
Vaguely.
Yeah. So basically, Nazi escaped to Argentina. Eventually, Israel bounty hunters hunted him down, brought him back. They prosecuted and executed him. Which
has got to be a really cool job title.
It's also going to be an incredible abuse of international law, but we can talk about that at a later time. But basically, so this guy Alfred Krupp got convicted for slave labor, and basically all the charges against him. And his charge was 12 years imprisonment, and forfeiture of all property. And this happened in what was it? When did this take place? I can't think of the date. I can't find it. But anyway, I think it was 1947. That's what it was. The trial happened in 1947. He was pardoned in 1951.
Interesting. By who?
By John J. McCloy. He was a lawyer / advisor in the United States to the president. And his entire property was restored to him in 1951.
Why? What was the rationale there?
I don't know that one. I cannot answer that.
Huh.
I don't know. Probably because America didn't want a precedent of people who created arms being guilty.
That makes sense.
That'd be my guess. Fun fact. So he got all that restored. Fun fact, though. He was the CEO. The CFO of the company got 7 years, served a full sentence.
Oh, man. That sucks.
Yeah.
See, they agree with me. The money guy, he's got to go down.
Oh, man. Yeah.
That's crazy.
I don't... What was it? The Krupp guy, though. Dude, he made so much money during the war. Oh my god. It was... it was slave wait. He used 100,000 different slaves during the...
Wow.
100,000 Jews to make his money. And that company is still around today.
Crazy.
Isn't that, it's nuts? Like,
It's nuts, yeah. And
how is that allowed to happen?
man, I can't believe they haven't changed the name.
But they did.
Ah,
Yeah.
okay.
You want to know what's it called? Oh, I'm gonna find out what it's called. It's not changed really. Oh yeah, now no, it's called ThyssenKrupp now. So they changed the name, but not really.
Interesting.
I don't.
What a unique.
Yeah.
What a unique situation.
The name wasn't changed until 1991, and it was only because it was bought out.
Huh.
Yeah.
Was it so like there was a seizure of all property, then the guy gets his property restored, and then there's nothing else?
Yeah. Then he was.
So basically, he just spent like 2 years in prison.
4 years, but yeah. 48.
Damn, man.
Yeah. Can you imagine that? You're literally 100,000 slave labor to create guns and military stuff for the Nazis. 4 years in prison, gets everything back.
And so he basically just, as far as his kids are concerned, that was straight profit.
Apologies for that brief recess.
Sam, what I was telling Ethan was that the CEO of the arms industry I was talking about in a comparison, he was actually charged with crimes against humanity, all the counts, conspiracy to commit murder, went to jail for 4 years on his on his 12-year term, and he had his He had his property taken away from him. But in 1951, he was pardoned, and he had everything returned to him. And the company is still around today. They used 100,000 slave labor Jews.
Well, you see, slavery wasn't one of the things we were charging him for, so...
Because that's not a crime against humanity.
No, apparently not.
But no, he was pardoned by the U.S. in 1951. And his company is still active today. But it's funny, though, because he was the CEO. The CFO was never pardoned and served his full 7 years.
Well, someone's got to take the fall, I guess. Maybe not, actually, but,
Yeah.
maybe they just forgot about him.
Anyway.
That honestly seems more likely.
That also, yeah. I don't know, man. Maybe he just paid his way out.
Sends out a letter, it gets lost in the mail.
But, his kids are still profiting 100% from that. They're probably millionaires.
Wonder if there's a German version of reparations.
There isn't an American version of reparations, sir.
That's funny. Affirmative action, kind of. Not really, but kind of. It's the closest thing we're ever going to get.
Anyway.
Yes, so the next topic, Sam, I think you're going to like this because it kind of goes on to the materialism aspect of this, is the question of whether... So the idea is that in the sense of a mixture of biology, psychology, and philosophy, is that we have these things in our brain called mirror neurons. And it's what lets us feel empathy when we see somebody else being sad. We're like, oh, now I feel sad, kind of in connection to that person. And so I should either help them or stop doing the thing that's making them sad. And that's mirror neurons. And so the idea is that maybe the Nazis just didn't have them. And so we can't blame them for their actions, necessarily. More than anybody else. I would like your specific opinion on this.
So, it's funny. I would say that, based on where I'm coming from, the whole build up to that was almost a sort of redundancy with the final point. It's just so. Here's my perspective, my philosophical summary, basically of my worldview. Real quick here, because we're talking about important things and not my stupid little perspective. So the big debate in psychology, right? That you learn about in your 101 psychology class, thing that they're always talking about is nature versus nurture. Now, if you take a step back from that, you start to realize something odd. between nature and nurture, you have two things that aren't your fault. So
I've actually never given that. I've never had that explained to me before. That's really funny.
That is funny.
Yeah.
I'm gonna steal that at some point. I hope you know.
Yeah,
All
for
right,
sure.
please take it. So, like, yeah, that's where my whole philosophy comes from. Is basically everyone is born not on purpose in any particular way. So you have certain material like conditions that are occurring in your body at the moment of your birth, and then uh, from the moment of conception, you have these outside forces acting on that form that cause it to change shape and react in different ways. And as you grow older, that whole system becomes more complex and consciousness comes out of it, but it's still the same system. It's still cause and effect. Ultimately,
Right.
that's what everything is. And so, when we're talking about, oh, should we, are the Nazis, are these SS officers to blame for their actions? Um, well, that really comes down to what you mean by blame. If by blame do you mean, okay, here is this individual entity that committed this action and we should do something about it? Yeah, I would say that they are to blame in that sense. But in the sense of, should we make this individual hurt or suffer in some retributive sense because of what they've done? That I would disagree with, because on a fundamental level, if you were born on the same day under the same conditions that that person was born in the same body, and then you lived in the same world that they did day in and day out, by the time you get to the front of that gas chamber, you would have pulled the lever too, because there's nothing transcendent that's going to like pull you morally one way or the other. It's just going through the motions. So what you should do in the case where you need to assign blame, um, if the Nazis, if these SS officers about them, and we do, because someone who lacks empathy like that is terrifying, just practically speaking, even. Um, what should be done is effort should be made to make this person who has done this horrible act um, into something that the world can instead benefit from. That would be my perspective.
It's interesting. It's
So,
almost it's a very similar argument as to the mirror neurons, but like it's philosophy instead of biology. But it seems like the same
so like,
idea, though. Like not like necessarily in like how it's formed, but the outcome.
so like, like even using like this particular instance or this particular example. Okay, so let's say that all these SSR participated in this. They are for some reason or another lacking the mirror feel empathy for other people. That makes them dangerous to individuals going about their day-to-day lives. So what we should do is we should take these mirror neuron lacking individuals, separate them from the greater population, and most likely to a certain extent from each other. At least moderate that, and then we should see, well, uh, what artistic, scientific, or other developments can we draw forth from these mirror neuron lacking people? What can they contribute now that they've been kept away from people to whom they are dangerous?
So, first, is that like your actual suggestion, or is it just a hypothetical?
Um, I suppose it has to be the hypothetical. I mean, I am
Assuming,
not.
okay, so assuming these mirror neurons, so like, I don't even know, like, is that real? Has that been proven?
It's theoretical, but I mean, it's a theory at this point. If that's the thing, like we have like areas of the brain that show empathy, and the idea is, what if we
Right,
lack this
right.
empathy?
But this was an argument made about neurology and psychology in the '60s, so and like earlier than that. So I have to imagine it wasn't like quite as advanced as we have now.
But I feel
Do
like
you
there's an
know
idea.
how that argument?
So, like, the people in the Nuremberg trials were not tested for the presence of
Yeah.
mirror neurons. So, I think that's what it comes down
I mean,
to.
yes, but I mean, I think it was something that we were presented in class, and I think it's a good like idea of like, well, what if none of these? Well, I mean, they didn't feel empathy for the Jews. I mean, there's no way they did.
Mhm.
So I mean, what if they were just completely lacking mirror neurons? Were they all lacking mirror neurons? Probably not. But it's a good idea. It's a philosophical discussion.
Well, I would argue actually. So there are plenty of stories I've read about SS officers. Like there was this thing I read like a year ago. It was a report listed by from an SS officer talking about how the atrocities that they were making the SS members do was making them worse soldiers. They were vomiting all the time, that kind of thing. So I would argue it's pretty difficult to say they didn't have empathy.
Yes, but we're not putting on trial the average commando. We're putting on trial the head honchos who decided all this. And so it could be argued that...
Oh, I thought you were saying, like, literally none of them.
No.
Like, none of the Nazis
the
at
ones
all.
who committed the murder and, like, didn't immediately get repulsed by the act, did they lack mirror neurons?
Right, so that's messier, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, I think that our legal system, it's based on, like, it's based on, oh God, I can't believe I forgot. But it's based on the idea that you can punish people for things.
Hold on, I'm gonna take a 2-second break here and tell you that the governor of Maine just declared the Easter Bunny's job is essential. Go on.
Well, he is.
He is essential.
Now, actually, I was reading a story about that earlier. This is going to go off on a complete tangent.
Quickly
that's
then.
Kind
quickly.
of a dick move.
Oh,
why?
I'm making him go out.
Yeah. That's
He wanted
now
1 year off, man.
You've basically just set out to all the parents. It's like, all right, now I know you're isolated at home, but now you need to go and put a mask on and invest in some plastic eggs and Snickers bars.
That's
otherwise,
funny.
That's ridiculous. Listen.
Otherwise, the governor
I'm taking the Easter Bunny
liar.
side. I'm taking the Easter Bunny side here. He has a very seasonal business. This rabbit goes out 1 day a year, and he has to make all of his money to last him another 364 days. And you want him to skip that working day? Come on, man. That's not fair. He is an essential business because his business would go out of business without this day of business.
So mirror neurons.
Okay. The Easter Bunny is too big to fail. Mirror neurons.
Yeah, but so the idea that people can be punished for things is that's the center of our legal system. Like, we can find someone guilty, but this whole mirror neurons argument, that's something that's arguing for an entire different legal system.
Well, you could make the argument that, I feel like retribution isn't the only reason to have a legal system. We can make the argument that we could still have the legal system and say, like, oh, we're not putting him in jail to make him guilty, to say, like, oh, you could put him in there, like, as a deterrent, saying, like, we will not allow
deterrent theory. That's what I was thinking of. But no. So what I'm saying is, it's a very, I hate saying the word slippery slope, but it is a slippery slope when you say, well, can we really find this person guilty? They literally couldn't have done anything else. And if that's something you want to say, especially if you take it from Sam's perspective. So Sam is instead arguing for an entirely different view on the legal system, if not an entirely different legal system. Entirely. God, I hate that I said the word that much. But
good morning.
What I'm saying is, our legal system, and certainly the legal system that they had in place at that time, simply is not capable of dealing with the argument that someone who does something wrong literally could not have done anything else, because no one can, because they're born this way, and then factors shape them in another way, and then there's nothing else they can do. So I'm not even necessarily saying I disagree with that perspective, major in sociology. But
it's
what I'm saying is we would instead have to completely rewrite the legal system, because how do you charge anyone with murder?
Well, I mean, they still
You
committed
could say,
murder.
well, they have an insufficient amount of mirror neurons. Maybe they just need to go to, But what I'm saying is the the context of everything changes when you argue that no one can control their actions in any way. They are just products of whatever concoction created them. And
Ooze.
instead, we're just finding out that they're missing pieces that we consider important in popular society. But if that's the case, then like, why do we consider them important at all? If it's just natural, it's natural. Then who
It's
cares, right?
yeah, I do like that. Like the slippery slope is only really a fallacy when you don't say how one thing would necessarily lead to another. But I mean, when you say, okay, so this person lacked a certain amount of mirror neurons, therefore we cannot hold them responsible for their actions. At the
Yeah.
same time, this other person, well, they suffer from borderline personality disorder. Therefore, they lack certain essential blockers in their brains that the rest of us have, so they can't be held responsible for this arson. And this person had depression, so they can't be held responsible for this. And this person, they were born with a slightly smaller prefrontal cortex, therefore they had worse decision-making capabilities than anyone else. Therefore, we can't hold them as responsible as someone else with a bigger prefrontal cortex. Like it if you can make the argument for mirror neurons, your brain is the basic premise there.
My own personal thoughts is I kind of agree, but although I would say my reasoning is a little bit different, regardless of whether they have mirror neurons, I would say you could.
What I mean, you do bring the actual legal insight to this, considering both of us are complete laymen. So,
Well,
if there's
Yeah.
anything you can draw from there,
well, mostly, well, if you commit murder and there's no intent, you can still get manslaughter, but that's besides the point.
Mhm.
I would argue from like the idea of what justifies our legal system, that even if you were completely lacking mirror neurons, that it would still completely be justified to jail you for the crime, just as a deterrent effect for society, as saying, we do not find this okay, regardless of your intent. You did this action, or regardless of whether you could feel the intent necessarily or feel like
Right,
the
but
empathy, you should still be jailed. Which I think is what you guys are
but
also
if
saying.
someone doesn't if someone doesn't care, then they don't care.
But it's not a deterrent for them. It's a deterrent for the people
Well,
that
if they lack
care.
well, I mean, if they lack the mirror neurons, then they don't care about doing the action. And if they also have, some other thing that means they don't care about the consequences, which you could very easily argue just as easily as neurons at least, then, I mean, can you really hold someone responsible if they do something with full knowledge of the consequences, and of what they're doing? But you just say, well, I mean, their brain doesn't allow them to care about these things. So,
I'm saying in the situation where we recognize that that's a thing, it wouldn't. I would say that they should be in jail regardless of whether they could be responsible. If they did the action, then I think it is a necessity not only for society but also a society of putting them in a place where they can't do it again.
with you that this is like a basis of our legal system.
Well, I mean, not our current one, but I'm saying that in James's ideal society.
So here's the thing: is the idea of a deterrent, or the legal system acting as a deterrent. I mean, you can think about how it works in theory, right?
Yeah.
But if we look back in history, we've tried some much stronger deterrents on people, and it failed to deter them. We used to lash people to wheels and hit them for looking weird at the Pope. And now that's an exaggeration, obviously, but when we come back from a history of systemic torture and public execution and all these other spectacles of gore and impaling and all of these things seem to have failed in reducing the overall number of people doing bad things, considering that number just grew with population.
Yeah,
I think that maybe deterrent theory might not hold water ultimately.
and if I can just say, I just want to say one thing, and then like it's just one small point. If I can interject my tiny little amount of knowledge that I remember from my law stuff from undergrad, it's that Sven, who for anybody who is listening to this, I don't actually know who's listening to this, but the law guy at our university who's my advisor, and I took a lot of law related classes with him, he was of the heavy opinion and taught in his classes that there was a significant amount of research, and I read some of it, that showed that deterrence theory, at least as a singular source for a basis for a legal system, was just not effective in any way. And there is a lot of scholarly articles and academic research and legal research, well, legal is academic, but that goes into arguing that deterrence theory really shouldn't be the basis of a legal system.
Yes, but and generally I agree that deterrence isn't something to base something on. Obviously, I think, what do you call it? I can't think of the word, but you want to make somebody a better part of the society, and I cannot think of it at all.
Reform?
Reform. I think that's a much better system to try to emulate. But I think in this situation, I was thinking of have you ever read the interviews of true sociopaths? When you ask them hey, why don't you just murder everyone? They're like, well, because I'm deterred from it. Because of the pros and cons weighed against murdering somebody for my own benefit. So, I mean, if we're talking about somebody who lacks mirror neurons, who lacks empathy, you're essentially talking about sociopaths. And so I think at that point, a deterrence would be an important factor, specifically for this group of people that lack mirror neurons.
Right, but that's not always, it's not a universal thought. Frequently, it's not necessarily deterrence, it's that, they just don't want to. I would also argue
don't they
that...
want to?
I mean, everyone's different.
Part of that is probably because they'll go to jail.
I mean, part of it, yeah, but you can't say for sure.
I would argue that a lot of people don't murder because of that.
Yeah. It's certainly...
What a fearsome part.
Well, I mean, when we're talking about, people, selling drugs on the side, that's, their only way of life, yes, deterrence isn't going to do jack shit, because that's, how they need to survive.
Cut.
No. What?
Okay.
What?
You said...
What?
You swore.
Oh, I didn't hear that. Sorry, that was my natural vocabulary. Well, so when you see people who are selling drugs trying to survive in, a low-income area, yes, deterrence isn't going to do anything. But for somebody that's, thinking, well, if I murder this person, I could benefit. Well, then I feel like deterrence might actually be useful. There's just not a significant portion of society, in our case, in our actual world, that it would be effective as a legal system, is how I would think of it. But in the hypothetical, where there's a large population of people that lack mirror neurons, the idea of going to jail for it, I think, would actually be quite the deterrence. Or quite the,
I suppose I can agree with that in a general sense.
Yeah, I guess. But at that point, if we're acknowledging that these people, because of some...
What do you mean, these people?
The mirror neuron-less people. If we're to say that they are simply not capable of functioning in our society in a normal way, then, again, that requires some amount of reformation to the legal system, because that's us saying that, we are creating laws, pretty much, for these people and these people alone. And also, once again on the slippery slope, why don't we just do what Sam was suggesting? Just put them all in a cage, man. If they're not capable of complying with what we consider normal society,
It doesn't need to be a cage. It could be something like the villages.
or like a concentration camp,
Oh, wait, do you mean like a death camp or an actual concentration camp?
like an actual concentration
Oh, okay,
camp.
yeah.
Like just put them in a camp, man. That's exactly
A
what
camp
I
where
mean.
we concentrate
I think,
them, nonetheless.
yeah, I mean, this is pretty much exactly what the original goal was in Germany. The Jews are not capable of living in our common society. They don't share the same values. They're not able to comply with what we consider normal laws. And thus they must be separated from us. But we don't want to kill them because, the human rights and whatever. So, and obviously it escalated pretty quickly from there. So, I mean, what I'm saying is, I, I think that, you know, it's a very ironic kind of argument to say that they are simply an inferior life form.
Wow.
Yeah, this is where John Stuart Mill comes in for me philosophically. So, uh, uh, interesting guy. Didn't think things through entirely, but his ideas laid the ground for a lot of great thinkers after him. He was a horrible hypocrite. Oh, I could go on a tangent about that, but that's not what we're talking about here. And James has us on a limited recording.
Yes.
In any case, yeah, it's like basically, I think if you're going to have a reform-based justice system or a justice system where you have to separate people from society because they're fundamentally different, you also have to take into consideration that the central goal behind of all of this is to reduce the amount of suffering that everyone has as much as you can. And so that would mean that if you were to build these concentration camps, they should at least be nice ones. maybe with some little rec rooms and such. It's just you're trying to create a society wherein you want to limit the suffering that exists through all the resources you have available to do so.